I've been sitting in the parking lot of Mercy River General for 7 minutes trying to remember which floor my office is on. That's not a metaphor. I'm not being dramatic. I literally cannot recall whether I work on the second floor or the third floor. And the fact that both answers feel equally correct is the first thing I need you to understand before I tell you anything else. My name is Nora Kauffman. I'm 36 years old. I have a bachelor's degree in health information management from a state school I'm still paying for. And for the past 4 years, I've worked in the Compliance and Data Integrity Division at Mercy River General Hospital, a 400-bed regional medical center in a mid-sized city I'm choosing not to name. My job is not exciting. I want to be clear about that. I reconcile records. I compare discharge summaries against billing codes, cross-reference admission timestamps against bed management logs, flag discrepancies for review, and generate monthly audit reports that almost no one reads. I am not a nurse. I am not a doctor. I have no clinical role whatsoever. I sit in a windowless office shared with one other person, and I look at spreadsheets until my eyes itch. And then I go home. The most dramatic thing that had ever happened to me at work before last month was discovering that a coder had accidentally billed a 93-year-old woman for a prenatal ultrasound. I need you to understand the kind of person I am because it matters. I am thorough. I am boring. I notice when a date is wrong by 1 digit, and I flag it. That is my entire personality as far as this job is concerned, and it is the reason I found what I found. It started with a bed census reconciliation for the month of March. Every month, I pull the daily bed census reports, which track how many patients are in each bed at midnight, and I compare them against the admission-discharge transfer log, which is a running electronic record of every patient movement in the hospital. In a perfect system, these two reports would always agree. They never do. There are always small gaps. A patient transferred at 11:47 p.m. might not show up in the midnight census. A same-day surgery patient discharged at 12:03 a.m. might appear in both days. These are normal, boring discrepancies, and reconciling them is the kind of work that makes people's eyes glaze over when I describe it at parties, which is why I stopped describing it at parties roughly 3 years ago. On March 14th, I was working through the census data for March 7th, when I found a bed occupied on 4 West Room 412, Bed B that had no matching admission record. The bed management system said someone was in that bed at midnight. The ADT log said the bed was empty. This happens. It's usually a nursing station entry error, someone scanning a wristband on the wrong bed by accident, a float nurse unfamiliar with the unit's layout. I flagged it and moved on. On March 15th, working through the data for March 8th, the same bed was occupied again. Room 412, Bed B, still no ADT entry. I pulled the nursing unit activity log for 4 West and found nothing unusual. The charge nurse's shift summary didn't mention an extra patient. The medication administration record for that room only showed entries for Bed A, and the dietary order system had no tray ticket for Bed B. But the census said someone was there. I flagged it again. I added a note. Recurring phantom occupancy, 412-B, possible sensor error or badge reader malfunction. Recommend facilities check. I sent the note to my supervisor, Gerald Maines, who responded 4 hours later with, "Thanks, we'll forward." On March 16th, I almost didn't check March 9th's data. I was behind on a different audit, a billing code review for the emergency department, and I'd planned to skip ahead. But the pattern nagged at me. Not in any dramatic way. It nagged at me the way a typo nags at you. You know it doesn't matter, but you also know you'll think about it during dinner if you don't fix it. So I pulled March 9th. Room 412, Bed B was occupied again. And this time there was an ADT entry. The patient's name was Gerald Allen Cook, male, 67 years old, admitted to 4 West on March 9th at 2:14 a.m. with a primary complaint of chest tightness and shortness of breath. Attending physician, Dr. Priya Anand. The admission record was clean. It had a properly formatted medical record number, a valid insurance code, An emergency contact listed as Brenda Cook, wife, and a signed consent for treatment bearing a timestamp of 2:31 a.m. on March 9th. Nothing was unusual about it. It was an entirely normal admission record in every way except one. Gerald Allen Cook had died on March 5th, in this hospital, 4 days before this admission. I know he died because I had already processed his discharge record. Discharge type, deceased. Date of death, March 5th, 8:17 p.m. Attending at time of death, Dr. Ramos, hospitalist. The death summary was in the system. The body release authorization was in the system. The coroner notification was in the system. Gerald Allen Cook had been removed from the hospital's active patient census on March 5th at 9:02 p.m., 45 minutes after his death, which is standard for the paperwork to be completed. His records had been closed and sent to the coding queue. His final billing had been transmitted to Medicare. I had personally reviewed the discharge code 3 days earlier as part of a routine mortality documentation audit. DRG 291, heart failure with major complications. Everything was normal. He was dead and processed and done. And then he was back. I sat at my desk for a long time, staring at the two records side by side on my screen. The medical record number was identical, not similar identical. In our system, medical record numbers are unique and permanent. You get one when you first enter the hospital, and it follows you through every subsequent visit. Gerald Allen Cook's MRN was 00-4417832. It appeared on his death record from March 5th and on his admission record from March 9th. The same number, the same person. The system was not confused about who this was. My first thought was that it was a registration error. The admitting clerk on the night of March 9th had somehow pulled up the wrong patient record. Maybe a similar name. Maybe a transposed digit that the system auto-corrected and attached a new admission to a dead man's file. This happens rarely. And it's a serious compliance issue because it means a living patient's clinical information is being filed under someone else's identity, which can lead to medication errors, wrong patient procedures, and a cascade of billing problems. It's exactly the kind of thing my job exists to catch. I pulled the registration worksheet for the March 9th admission. The clerk who processed Gerald Cook's admission was Tanya Beal, a night shift registrar I'd spoken to maybe twice. The worksheet showed that she had scanned a government-issued photo ID and an insurance card at the time of registration. The scanned images were in the system. I opened them. The driver's license belonged to Gerald Allen Cook. The photo showed a white-haired man with deep-set eyes and a slightly crooked nose, wearing a blue-collared shirt. Date of birth, November 3rd, 1957. The insurance card was a standard Medicare card with the same name and a beneficiary number that matched the one already in our system from his previous visits. I looked at the license photo. Then I pulled up the scanned copy of the photo ID from Gerald Cook's earlier admission in February, the one that had ended in his death on March 5th. I put them side by side on my screen. Same man, same license number, same expiration date, same slightly crooked nose. The photos were not merely similar. They were the same image because it was the same card, because it was the same person. I want to be precise about what I felt in that moment because people tend to project feelings onto stories like this, and I don't want you imagining something I didn't experience. I was not frightened. I was not chilled. I felt the specific, focused irritation of someone who has found an error so blatant that it means hours of additional work. Someone had made a very large mistake, and now I was going to have to trace it, document it, report it, and probably sit in a meeting about it. I was annoyed. I drafted a preliminary incident report. Patient Gerald A. Cook, MRNOO-4417832, discharged deceased March 5th, readmitted March 9th under same MRN. Possible identity error. Possible system duplication. Recommend immediate chart review and registration audit. I sent it to Gerald Maines and CC'd the Director of Health Information Management, a woman named Patricia Ewan, whom I'd met exactly once at an all-staff meeting. Then I went to lunch. After lunch, I decided to look at the clinical notes from the March 9th admission. If this was a registration error, a living patient accidentally filed under a dead man's record, then the clinical notes would describe a real, living person receiving real care, and the physical details would probably not match Gerald Cook at all. That would make the error obvious and easy to fix. The clinical notes were thorough. The admitting nurse's assessment, timestamped 2:48 a.m. on March 9th, described a 67-year-old male presenting with substernal chest pressure and dyspnea on exertion. Vital signs: blood pressure 158/94, heart rate 88, respiratory rate 22, oxygen saturation 91% on room air. The nurse noted that the patient appeared his stated age, was oriented to person, place, and time, and was in moderate distress. Medical history listed hypertension, type 2 diabetes, prior myocardial infarction in 2019, and congestive heart failure and YHA class 3. I pulled up Gerald Cook's medical history from his previous admissions. Hypertension, type 2 diabetes, prior MAN in 2019, CHF and YHA class 3. Every detail matched. Either a living person with an identical medical history had been accidentally registered under a dead man's identity, which is so unlikely that I could feel the probability collapsing in my mind as I considered it, or the clinical team on 4 West had treated Gerald Allen Cook 4 days after he died. Gerald Maines responded to my incident report at 3:15 p.m. His reply was 3 sentences. "Thanks, Nora. I'll flag this for Patricia. Probably a system glitch during the MRN migration last month." We had not had an MRN migration last month. We had not had an MRN migration in the 4 years I'd been employed there. I knew this because MRN migrations are a major compliance event, and I would have been involved in the reconciliation. I stared at Gerald's email for a long time, then I read it again. Then I closed it and went back to the clinical notes. The March 9th admission continued for 3 days. Gerald Cook or whoever was in that bed received IV diuretics, supplemental oxygen, a cardiology consult, an echocardiogram, and serial troponin draws. The lab results were in the system. Troponin levels elevated but trending down. BNP markedly elevated, consistent with heart failure exacerbation. Basic metabolic panel showing mild renal impairment. These were real lab results drawn from a real person's blood. The lab system logs confirmed that specimens had been received, processed, and resulted on the analyzer. The blood had existed. It had been real blood with real chemistry values in real tubes that a real phlebotomist had drawn, and a real lab technician had run through a real machine. On March 12th, the patient was discharged. Discharge type routine. Discharge disposition, home with home health services. The discharge summary, signed by Dr. Anand, described a patient whose symptoms had improved with diuresis, whose oxygen saturation had stabilized at 95% on room air, and who was ambulatory and eager to return home. The summary included a follow-up appointment scheduled for March 26th at the hospital's outpatient cardiology clinic. The discharge instructions were printed and signed. The signature on file was a slightly shaky but legible cursive. Gerald A. Cook. I compared it to the signature on the consent form from his February admission, the one that ended in his death. The handwriting was the same. I'm not a forensic document examiner, but I've looked at thousands of patient signatures over 4 years, and I know what it looks like when 2 signatures come from the same hand. The slight leftward lean, the way the G looped below the line, the period after the A, the compressed letters in Cook, as though he always ran out of room. It was the same hand. I sat at my desk, and I felt something shift inside my understanding of the situation. And for the first time, it was not irritation. It was not fear either. It was something closer to the feeling you get when you're driving on a highway and you realize you've missed your exit 5 miles ago, and the next one isn't for 20 more miles, and the landscape doesn't look right, and your GPS has lost signal. It was the feeling of being somewhere you didn't account for. I pulled the discharge paperwork from March 5th, the death discharge. The body release authorization had been signed by Brenda Cook, listed as spouse and next of kin. The release was to Houghton Brothers Funeral Home. There was a fax confirmation in the file showing that the death certificate worksheet had been transmitted to the County Vital Records Office on March 6th. I did not have access to the county's records from my terminal, but the hospital's internal death log, maintained by the Medical Records Department, listed Gerald Allen Cook as deceased, with a case number and a cross-reference to the county filing. I want to stress something here. This wasn't a situation where the death had been ambiguous. He hadn't been briefly pulseless and then resuscitated. The death summary described a patient who had experienced progressive multi-organ decline over several days, whose family had elected comfort measures only status on March 4th, and who had died with his wife and a hospital chaplain present. The attending physician had performed a physical examination to confirm death. The time of death was recorded. The body had been released to a funeral home. The county had been notified. Every system in the hospital had processed this man's death and moved on. And then, 4 days later, every system in the hospital had processed this man's admission and moved on from that too, without conflict, without error flags, without any apparent awareness that these two events were mutually exclusive. I decided to go to 4 West. I don't usually visit the clinical floors. My work is entirely screen-based, and most nurses find it somewhere between confusing and annoying when someone from data integrity shows up in person, asking questions about a patient who was there 2 weeks ago. But I needed to see the room. I don't know exactly why. I think I needed to stand in the physical space where a dead man had apparently slept and breathed and had his blood drawn and signed his name and been told he could go home. 4 West is a cardiac step-down unit. It's quieter than the main medical floor's fewer call lights, more monitors. I took the elevator up and walked past the nursing station where 2 nurses were charting and didn't look up. Room 412 was at the end of the hallway near the fire exit. The door was half open. I looked in. Bed A held a sleeping woman connected to a telemetry monitor. Bed B was empty. The bed was made, the privacy curtain pulled back, the side table wiped clean. A standard hospital room between patients. Nothing wrong. Nothing unusual. No cold spots, no flickering lights, no sense of wrongness. It was just a room. But I stood in the doorway for a long time anyway, looking at that empty bed, thinking about the weight impression a body makes on a hospital mattress, and wondering whether the mattress I was looking at had any memory of the shape that had lain there. I went to the nursing station. The charge nurse on duty was a woman I didn't recognize, heavy-set, reading glasses on a beaded chain, a coffee mug with a cartoon cat on it. Her name badge said Denise Okoro, RN. "I'm from Data Integrity," I said. "I'm looking into a records discrepancy for a patient who was in 412-B earlier this month. Gerald Cook. Do you remember him?" Denise looked at me over her reading glasses. "Cook," she repeated. "The heart failure patient? Sure, I remember him. Nice man, quiet. His wife brought him those butter cookies from the Greek bakery on Ashland." "You remember him being here?" I said. "In March? Around the 9th through the 12th. "That sounds right. Did anything seem unusual about his stay?" Denise shrugged. "Not that I recall. He was pretty standard. Responded well to the Lasix. Dr. Anand was happy with his echo results. He walked the hallway twice the day before discharge. No oxygen needed. His wife picked him up." "Did you know," I said carefully, "that he was also a patient here in February? That admission ended on March 5th. "Sure," Denise said. "He'd been in and out. Heart failures like that. You stabilize them, send them home, they come back. Revolving door." "The February admission ended in his death, Denise." She looked at me, not with shock, not with confusion. She looked at me the way you look at someone who has said something slightly rude at a dinner party. A brief, evaluative pause. A recalibration of social footing. "I don't think that's right," she said. "It's in the system. Discharge type deceased. March 5th. Then there's probably an error in the system," she said, "because I took care of him on the 10th and 11th, and he was definitely alive. He told me about his granddaughter's violin recital. He asked me if the cafeteria still had the turkey club on Thursdays." I thanked her and walked away. In the elevator, I realized my hands were shaking. Not because I was afraid of Denise, or afraid of the room, or afraid of Gerald Cook. I was shaking because I had just encountered something that I had never encountered before in my professional life. A system that contained two mutually exclusive facts and showed no sign of distress about it. The death was real and documented. The readmission was real and documented. Both were in the system, and the system was fine. The system did not consider these events contradictory. The system had processed both of them with the same bureaucratic calm. And the people inside the system, Denise, Dr. Anand, Tanya Beale at the registration desk, had all participated without apparent confusion. I got back to my office, and my colleague, Martin Hess, was eating a sandwich at his desk. Martin has worked in data integrity for 11 years, which is 7 years longer than me, and he has the specific world weariness of someone who has seen every kind of records error a hospital can produce. "Martin," I said, "have you ever seen a deceased patient get readmitted under their own MRN?" "Sure," he said, not looking up from his sandwich. "Happens more than you'd think. Usually it's a registration clerk error. They pull up the wrong Cook or Smith or whatever and don't catch the deceased flag. You just merge the records and correct the registration. What if it's not a clerk error? What if the clinical notes match? What if the lab results match? What if the nurses remember the patient and describe him accurately?" Martin looked up. He chewed slowly. "Then it's a really interesting clerk error," he said. "Or you're losing it. One of the two." I went home that night and sat in my apartment, a one-bedroom on the east side, second floor, above a dry cleaner that makes the hallway smell like chemical warmth, and I opened my laptop and searched for Gerald Allen Cook. I found an obituary. It had been published on March 7th in the regional newspaper's online edition. Gerald Allen Cook, 67, of the city I'm not naming, passed away peacefully on March 5th at Mercy River General Hospital, surrounded by his loving family. He was preceded in death by his parents and a brother, Thomas. He was survived by his wife of 41 years, Brenda, his daughter Kelsey, and his granddaughter Lily. A celebration of life had been held on March 8th at Resurrection Lutheran Church. March 8th. The funeral or celebration of life, or whatever they had called it, had been held on March 8th. Gerald Cook had been admitted to Mercy River General at 2:14 a.m. on March 9th, less than 24 hours after his funeral. I read the obituary 3 more times. I looked at the small photo that accompanied it. White-haired man with deep-set eyes and a slightly crooked nose. The same man on the driver's license. The same man in the system. I closed my laptop and sat in the dark for a while, listening to the dry cleaner's ventilation system humming through the floor. My apartment is small enough that you can hear the hum from every room and the bedroom, the kitchen, even the bathroom if the fan isn't running. There's a crack in the bathroom mirror that was there when I moved in. A thin diagonal line that splits my reflection just below the left eye. And sometimes when I stand in front of it, I think about how long that crack has been there and how many faces it has divided before mine. That night I brushed my teeth without turning on the bathroom light because I didn't want to see the crack, and I didn't want to think about why I didn't want to see it. The next morning, I pulled every record I could find for Gerald Cook's March 9th admission. I wanted to find the seam, the place where the fabrication, if that's what this was, broke down. I started with the most physical, most unglamorous evidence I could think of. The specimen tracking log from the laboratory. When blood is drawn from a patient, the tubes are labeled with a barcode linked to the patient's MRN and a timestamp. The tubes are transported to the lab, scanned into the receiving system, loaded onto analyzers, and resulted. Each step generates a discrete log entry. I requested access to the lab's internal tracking system, which took most of the morning because it required authorization from the lab director, who required a written explanation, which I provided in the most carefully boring language I could manage. Reconciling specimen tracking data with admission records for quality assurance audit. Routine. At 1:40 p.m., I had access. I searched for MRNOO-4417832, date range March 9th through March 12th. The system returned 14 specimen entries. 14 tubes of blood drawn from Gerald Cook over 3 days, each one scanned, received, processed, and resulted. I clicked on the first entry. Drawn at 3:22 a.m. on March 9th by phlebotomist IDPH-1187. Received in lab at 3:41 a.m. Loaded on analyzer at 3:58 a.m. Resulted at 4:07 a.m. Troponin 1, 0.14 nanograms per milliliter. I looked up phlebotomist PH-1187 in the employee directory. Her name was Kara Jessup. I wrote down her name and badge number. Then I traced each of the remaining 13 specimens through the same chain. Every one of them had a complete tracking record. Every one had been drawn by a credentialed phlebotomist, transported within acceptable time windows, processed on calibrated analyzers, and resulted with values that were clinically consistent with a living person in heart failure. I felt something tighten in my chest. Not pain, a psychological tightness, a constriction of possibility, because I had been looking for the seam, and I wasn't finding one. Every layer I peeled back revealed more consistency, more completeness, more evidence that this admission had been real. Not real in the metaphysical sense, real in the bureaucratic sense. The system believed it. The system had documentation. The system could prove it. That afternoon, I called Houghton Brothers Funeral Home. I told the receptionist I was calling from Mercy River General's Health Information Management Department and needed to verify a body release from early March. She put me on hold. After 4 minutes, a man with a soft, careful voice came on the line and identified himself as David Houghton. "I'm trying to confirm that your facility received remains for a Gerald Allen Cook, released from our hospital on or around March 5th or 6th, I said. "Yes," David Houghton said. "We handled Mr. Cook's arrangements. Visitation on the 7th, celebration of life on the 8th, cremation on the 9th. "Cremation on the 9th, I repeated. "That's correct, per the family's wishes. And the cremation was completed on the 9th? "Yes, ma'am. We delivered the urn to Mrs. Cook on the 11th. I thanked him and hung up. Gerald Cook had been cremated on March 9th, the same day he was admitted to Mercy River General with chest tightness and shortness of breath. While his body was being reduced to ash at a funeral home across town, a man with his face, his name, his medical record number, his medical history, his insurance card, his handwriting, and his wife's butter cookies was lying in bed B of room 412, having his blood drawn and his heart monitored and his lungs listened to with a stethoscope. Before I went home that evening, I did something I do roughly once a week. I logged into the employee self-service portal to check whether my updated tax withholding from January had actually gone through, because payroll had told me twice that it was processed and my pay stubs still looked wrong. The portal loaded with my name in the upper right corner, Kauffman Nora J., and my employee ID, and my department, and my hire date, and my assigned location. Data integrity, floor 2, room 214B. I stared at that for a moment. Floor 2. My office was on the 2nd floor. I knew that. Of course I knew that. I clicked through to my pay stub, confirmed the withholding was still wrong, closed the portal, and put on my coat. But as I waited for the elevator, I thought about the number 2 and how certain I was of it now, and how strange it was that I'd been uncertain that morning in the parking lot. The elevator arrived. I got in and pressed 1 for the lobby, and as the doors closed, I saw the floor indicator above them. A row of numbers, 1 through 6, with the 2 currently lit. 2nd floor. I was on the 2nd floor. I had always been on the 2nd floor. I put my head down on my desk. Martin glanced over. "You okay?" "I'm fine." "You look like you're going to be sick." "I'm fine, Martin." I was not fine. That evening I went back to the electronic record and pulled something I hadn't thought to check before. The phone system. Mercy River General, like most hospitals, has bedside phones in every patient room. The phones are part of the hospital's internal telecom system, and every outgoing call generates a log entry. Room number, extension, number dialed, timestamp, and duration. I'd used the telecom logs once before for an audit involving a billing dispute where a patient claimed he'd never been told about a procedure, and the hospital's records showed a phone call from his room to his wife's cell phone 20 minutes after the consent was signed. I searched the telecom log for room 412, bed B extension, date range March 9th through March 12th. There were 3 outgoing calls. The first was on March 10th at 11:14 a.m. duration, 7 minutes. The number dialed was a local number that matched the home phone listed for Brenda Cook in the emergency contact field. The second was on March 10th at 6:47 p.m. Duration 12 minutes, same number, Brenda Cook's home phone. The third was on March 11th at 9:03 a.m. Duration 4 minutes, a different number. I ran it through the hospital's internal directory and got no match. I searched it in the outpatient scheduling system. It matched the main line for the cardiology clinic on the 3rd floor, the clinic where Gerald Cook's follow-up appointment was scheduled. A dead man had called his wife from his hospital bed. Twice. He'd talked to her for 7 minutes the first time and 12 minutes the second. And then he'd called the cardiology clinic, presumably to confirm or ask about the follow-up appointment that was already in the system. These were not phantom entries. The telecom system logged call duration, which meant the calls had been answered, which meant someone had picked up, which meant a voice had come through the line and spoken and been heard. I tried to imagine Brenda Cook's phone ringing. I tried to imagine her seeing the hospital's number on her caller ID. I tried to imagine her picking up and hearing what? Her dead husband's voice. A voice that sounded like her dead husband. And I tried to imagine what she said, and whether she sounded surprised, and whether she asked where he was, or whether she already knew. I closed the telecom log. I sat in the quiet office. The fluorescent light above my desk was buzzing at a frequency I'd never noticed before. A thin, insistent whine that seemed to originate not from the fixture, but from the air itself. My hands were on the keyboard, and they were not shaking. They were perfectly still. And I understood, in that moment, that I had moved past the part of this experience where my body reacted with appropriate alarm, and into a new part where my body had simply accepted that the ground was no longer where it used to be. I went home. I sat on my couch in my apartment with the lights off and the dry cleaner humming through the floor. On the kitchen table there was a coffee mug with a brown ring inside it from 3 days ago, and next to it a stack of mail I hadn't opened, and next to that a small ceramic dish shaped like a leaf that I'd bought at a flea market 2 years ago and used for my keys. The dish had a chip on one edge that I'd caused by dropping my keys into it too hard one night when I was tired. These objects were mine. This apartment was mine. The crack in the bathroom mirror was mine in the way that all inherited damages become yours. And I sat there among my things, and I thought about a phone ringing in a house where an urn sat on the mantelpiece, and the woman who lived there picking up and hearing her husband's voice asking about the turkey club on Thursday. I submitted a formal request for security footage from the ER entrance, time-stamped between 2 o'clock and 2:15 a.m. on March 9th. I sent it to the security department's general inbox. 3 days passed. Gerald Maines did not respond to my incident report. Patricia Ewan did not respond to the CC. The security department did not respond to my footage request. I continued working on my other audits, the ED billing review, a duplicate record cleanup project, the monthly bed census reconciliation. And every day, I also spent an hour or two pulling another thread from Gerald Cook's impossible readmission. I checked the dietary system. A tray ticket had been generated for room 412 bed B on March 10th, 11th, and 12th. The March 10th ticket noted a cardiac/diabetic diet with a patient preference annotation. No tomato, likes extra jello. I searched the dietary records from his February admission. Same annotation. No tomato, extra jello. I checked the pharmacy system. Medications had been dispensed. Furosemide 40 milligrams IV, potassium chloride 20 milliequivalents oral, lisinopril 10 milligrams oral, metformin 500 milligrams oral. Each dispensation was logged with a pharmacist verification timestamp and a barcode scan confirmation at the point of administration. The drugs had been real. They had been counted, dispensed from real inventory, verified by a real pharmacist, and administered to a real arm by a real nurse who scanned a real wristband. I checked the wristband. Every patient admitted to Mercy River General receives a printed wristband with their name, date of birth, MRN, and a barcode. The wristband printing log showed that a band for Gerald A. Cook, DOB November 3, 1957, MRNOO-4417832, had been printed at 2:22 a.m. on March 9th by the admitting registrar's workstation. Someone had worn that wristband. Someone's wrist had been inside it. I was running out of layers. Every system I checked confirmed the same thing. A man who was dead had been admitted, treated, and discharged, and every institutional mechanism designed to track, verify, and document a patient's existence had functioned exactly as designed. There was no error. There was no glitch. The system hadn't failed. The system had worked perfectly. And that was the problem. On March 20th, 6 days after I first found the discrepancy, I received a response to my security footage request. It came not from the security department, but from Gerald Maines, my supervisor. The email read, "Hi Nora, security let me know you requested ER entrance footage for March 9th. I wanted to flag that footage requests related to patient records need to go through HIM first, per our updated protocol. I've asked security to route the request to Patricia's office. She'll follow up with you." There was no updated protocol. I had filed footage requests before twice, both times for fall investigation audits, and both times I had gone directly to security without issue. I checked the hospital's policy portal. The last update to the information request policy was dated November of the previous year, 4 months before any of this. There was no mention of routing footage requests through HIM. I replied to Gerald's email, "Can you send me the updated protocol document? I want to make sure I have the current version." He replied 11 minutes later, "I'll check with Patricia and get back to you." He did not get back to me. On March 21st, I arrived at work 14 minutes early because I hadn't been able to stay in my apartment any longer. The dry cleaner's ventilation had been running all night. It sometimes does that, a low industrial hum that travels through the floor joists and settles into the frame of my bed, and I'd lain there in the dark, listening to it, thinking about wristbands and phone calls, thinking about the specific physical reality of a wristband being clasped around a wrist, and a phone receiver being lifted from a cradle, and a voice traveling through a wire, the snap of the adhesive closure against skin, the click of the receiver, the sound of a number being dialed. Someone had felt all of that. Someone had been real enough to feel all of that. Martin was already at his desk when I got in. He was eating a granola bar and scrolling through what looked like a duplicate record report. "Martin," I said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to actually think about it before you answer." He looked at me with the guarded patience of a man who has been married for 22 years. "How often do you check the deceased patient flag when you're doing ADT reconciliation?" "Every time there's a readmit under the same MRN," he said. "It's part of the standard check." "And the system flags it automatically when someone tries to admit a patient whose record is marked deceased?" "It should. There's a hard stop in the registration module. If the MRN has a deceased flag, the system won't let you create a new encounter without a supervisor override." "A supervisor override?" "Right. Someone with admin-level access has to enter a credential and a reason code. It's logged." I turned to my terminal and navigated to the registration module's override log. I searched for MRN 00-4417832 on March 9th. The log returned one entry. Override timestamp, 2:19 a.m. Override credential, a DM-SUP-07. Reason code, 14. Patient identity, verified, previous deceased flag entered in error. Reason code 14. I read it 3 times. Previous deceased flag entered in error. Someone with administrative access had overridden the system's only safeguard against admitting a dead patient by telling the system that the death itself was the mistake. The system had accepted this explanation, cleared the hard stop, and allowed the admission to proceed. The death hadn't been deleted. It was still in the record, still visible, still documented, but it had been reclassified in the logic of the registration system as an error. A wrong entry. A data quality issue. The machine had been told that death was a clerical mistake, and the machine had believed it. I looked up credential ADM-SUP-07 in the staff directory. It was assigned to the admitting department's night supervisor, a man named Raymond Carnes. I had never met him. Night shift administration and day shift compliance don't overlap, but his employee record was in the system. Raymond T. Carnes, hired 2011, admitting supervisor night shift, Sunday through Thursday. I composed an email to Raymond Carnes. I kept it neutral, professional, the kind of email I'd sent 100 times. Hi Raymond, I'm conducting a routine audit of registration overrides for Q1 and noticed an override on MRN00-4417832 dated March 9th. Could you provide some context on the circumstances? Just need a brief note for the audit file. Thanks, Nora Kauffman. Data Integrity. I sent it at 8:47 a.m. At 9:12 a.m., I received a read receipt. At 5 p.m., when I left for the day, he had not replied. That evening, I did something I hadn't done before. I drove to Resurrection Lutheran Church. I don't know exactly what I expected to find. I suppose I was still looking for the place where Gerald Cook's death and Gerald Cook's impossible return finally contradicted each other in a way that couldn't be reconciled. The church was a modest brick building on a residential street, the kind of church that seats maybe 200 people and shares a parking lot with a dentist's office. It was locked when I arrived, which I expected. A glass-fronted bulletin board near the entrance displayed service times, a schedule of Lenten soup suppers, and a printed program from a recent event. I looked at it through the glass. Third item from the top, Celebration of Life, Gerald Allen Cook, March 8th, 2 p.m. It was real. The funeral had been real. The church had hosted it, printed a program for it, posted it in the bulletin board along with the soup suppers and the youth group car wash. Gerald Cook's death had been observed, mourned, and commemorated by a community of actual people. And then, apparently, it had been overridden by a man named Raymond Carnes using reason code 14. I sat in my car in the church parking lot, and I thought about Brenda Cook, Gerald's wife, the woman who had signed the body release authorization, the woman who had been listed as the emergency contact on both the death admission and the impossible readmission, the woman whose home phone had received 2 calls from her dead husband's hospital bed. Had she been at the church on March 8th, accepting condolences, listening to people say kind things about her husband? And had she then, somehow, been at the hospital the next night watching the same husband get a wristband and an IV and a dietary tray with extra Jell-O? I almost called her. I had her phone number. It was in the emergency contact field. I sat with my phone in my hand for several minutes, the number on my screen, my thumb hovering over the call button. But what would I say? Mrs. Cook, I'm calling from the hospital. I just need to confirm, is your husband dead? Because our records say yes and also no, and your phone records say he called you twice from his bed, and I'm trying to determine which version of your life is the real one. I put my phone away and drove home. On March the 22nd, I checked my email first thing. Raymond Carnes had not replied. Gerald Maines had not followed up on the footage request. Patricia Ewan had not acknowledged the incident report. The machinery of institutional accountability, which I had spent 4 years serving and maintaining, was perfectly silent on the subject of Gerald Cook, but the system itself was not silent. The system had plenty to say if you asked the right questions. I pulled the outpatient scheduling module and searched for Gerald Cook's follow-up appointment, the one listed in his March 12th discharge summary. Cardiology Clinic, March 26th, 10:30 a.m., Dr. Anand. The appointment was in the system. It had been auto-generated by the discharge order set and confirmed by the clinic's scheduling coordinator. As far as the outpatient system was concerned, Gerald Cook was a living patient with an upcoming appointment. And if he didn't show up, someone would call the number on file to reschedule. March 26th was 4 days away. A dead man had an appointment. I need to tell you about what happened next, but first I need to explain something about the way hospitals manage patient identity, because it's important for understanding why what I found on March 23rd disturbed me more than anything before it. Every patient in our system has what's called a Master Patient Index Entry, an MPI. The MPI is the single source of truth for who a patient is. It contains their name, date of birth, social security number, address, phone number, and every medical record number they've ever been assigned at our facility. When there are duplicate records, when the same person has been accidentally registered twice under different MRNs, we merge them in the MPI. When there are overlaid records, when two different people have been accidentally registered under the same MRN, we split them. Merges and splits are the most sensitive operations in health information management because they determine, at the most fundamental level, whose information belongs to whom. A bad merge can kill someone. A bad split can erase someone. I've personally processed over 300 merges and maybe 40 splits, and every single one required a documented verification process and a supervisor sign-off. On March 23rd, I opened the MPI entry for Gerald Allen Cook. I expected to see one record, MRN 00-4417832, with encounter history showing his February admission, his March 5th death, and his March 9th impossible readmission, all linked to the same identity. What I found instead made me put my coffee down very carefully, as though sudden movement might change what was on the screen. Gerald Allen Cook had 2 MPI entries. The first was the one I knew, MRN 00-4417832. It showed his full encounter history, including both the death and the readmission. But there was a second entry, created on March 9th at 2:14 a.m., the exact time of his readmission with a different MRN, 00-4417833, 1 digit off. The second entry had been created, populated with identical demographic information, and then immediately merged into the first entry. The merge was logged at 2:20 a.m., 1 minute after Raymond Carnes' override. The reason for the merge was listed as duplicate entry same patient. Do you understand what this means? The system had tried to create a new identity. At 2:14 a.m. on March 9th, when someone who identified himself as Gerald Cook arrived at the emergency department, the registration system had initially done the correct thing. It had recognized that MRN 00-4417832 was flagged as deceased, and instead of attaching a new encounter to a dead man's record, it had generated a new MRN, a new identity, as if to say, this may be the same name, but it cannot be the same person because the person with this name is dead. The system had tried to tell the truth, and then someone had overridden that truth. Raymond Carnes, or whoever was using his credential, had merged the new MRN back into the old one and overridden the deceased flag, and forced the system to accept that the man standing in the emergency department and the man whose body had been cremated that same day were not merely similar, not merely related, but identical, the same person, continuous, uninterrupted by death. The system had tried to protect the boundary between alive and dead, and someone had manually erased that boundary and taught the system that it didn't matter. I printed the MPI merge log. I printed the override log. I printed the ADT records for both admissions, the death summary, the lab tracking records, the telecom logs, and the dietary annotations. I put all of it in a manila folder, and I wrote on the tab, Cook, Gerald A. Discrepancy. Then I locked the folder in my desk drawer, because I was no longer confident that the institutional channels I had been using were functional, and I wanted a physical copy of everything in case the digital records changed. That might sound paranoid. 3 weeks earlier, it would have sounded paranoid to me, too. On March 24th, I looked for other cases. I don't know why I waited this long. Maybe I was hoping Gerald Cook was singular, a one-time aberration, a bizarre confluence of errors, something I could eventually file and forget. But the MPI merge had changed something in my understanding. The merge meant that someone had a process for this. You don't override a deceased flag and merge a duplicate MRN in under 60 seconds unless you've done it before. It was too smooth, too practiced, too precisely executed. I wrote a query against the MP1 database. Show me every instance in the past 12 months where a merge was performed on the same day as a new admission, where one of the merged MRNs had a deceased flag, and where the merge reason was duplicate entries, same patient. I wasn't sure the query would work. I wasn't sure the database fields would support that level of filtering. I ran it anyway. The query returned 4 results. Gerald Cook was one of them. The other 3 were Dolores Faye Minter, age 81, deceased October 14th, readmitted October 19th, 5 days later, discharged October 24th, routine, to home. James Robert Okafor, age 54, deceased December 2nd, readmitted December 5th, 3 days later, discharged December 11th, routine, to home. Anne-Marie Lucille Fenton, age 70, deceased January 18th, readmitted January 22nd, 4 days later, discharged January 28th, routine, to home. 4 patients, 4 deaths. 4 readmissions, each occurring 3 to 5 days after the recorded death. Each time, the system had generated a new MRN, and each time, the new MRN had been immediately merged back into the deceased record. Each time, the override credential was ADM-SUP-07. Each time, the reason code was 14. Each time, the patient had been treated, stabilized, and sent home. I stared at the screen. The office was quiet. Martin had gone to a meeting. The fluorescent light above my desk was buzzing at its thin frequency, and the sound seemed closer than before, as though the fixture had lowered an inch overnight. 4 people had died in this hospital and come back. No, that's not precise enough, and precision is the only thing I have. 4 people had died in this hospital, and then the hospital had admitted 4 people with the same names, same MRNs, same medical histories, same handwriting, same dietary preferences, same emergency contacts, same faces on their driver's licenses, and every system in the hospital, registration, nursing, pharmacy, laboratory, dietary, telecom billing, scheduling, had processed these admissions as normal, had treated these patients as real, had sent them home. I pulled the clinical notes for Dolores Minter. She had died of complications from a stroke on October 14th. She was readmitted on October 19th with right-sided weakness and slurred speech, the same symptoms that had brought her in originally. She was treated, improved, and discharged. Her discharge instructions included a referral to outpatient physical therapy. The physical therapy department had a record of her intake evaluation, completed on November 1st. A therapist named Beth had worked with her on balance exercises and grip strength. The notes described a pleasant, cooperative patient who brought hard candies to her appointments and kept apologizing for being slow. I checked the telecom log for Dolores Minter's room during her readmission. 2 outgoing calls, both to the same number. I cross-referenced it against her emergency contact field. It was her daughter's cell phone. A dead woman had called her daughter from her hospital bed. Twice. I pulled the records for James Okafor. He had died of sepsis secondary to a perforated bowel on December 2nd. He was readmitted on December 5th with abdominal pain and fever. He was treated with IV antibiotics, improved, and discharged. His follow-up appointment in the surgical clinic had been attended. The surgeon's note described a well-healing incision and recommended a bland diet for 6 weeks. The telecom log showed 1 outgoing call from his room, 3 minutes long, to a number that matched the main line for his employer's human resources department. A dead man had called his workplace from his hospital bed. I pulled the records for Anne-Marie Fenton. She had died of respiratory failure due to advanced COPD on January 18th. She was readmitted on January 22nd with acute exacerbation of COPD. She was treated with bronchodilators and steroids, improved, and discharged. Her pulmonology follow-up had been attended. The pulmonologist had adjusted her inhaler regimen and noted that she was doing well, better than expected given severity of disease. Better than expected. Given severity of disease, given that she had been dead 4 days earlier. Each of these patients had obituaries. I found them online, one by one, that evening in my apartment. Dolores Minters described a retired schoolteacher who loved crossword puzzles and was survived by 3 children. James Okafors described an electrical engineer who coached his son's soccer team and made the best jollof rice his colleagues had ever tasted. Anne-Marie Fentons described a former bookkeeper who had outlived 2 husbands and was known for her bluntness and her lemon bars. Each of them had been mourned. Each of them had been buried or cremated, and each of them, according to the hospital's records, was currently alive, at home, keeping their follow-up appointments, calling their families, taking their medications, living their lives. I did not sleep that night. I sat on my couch with the manila folder in my lap, the ceramic leaf dish on the table beside me holding my keys, the chipped edge catching the light from the street lamp outside. I thought about what kind of thing I was looking at. I need to be honest with you here about the shape of my thoughts, because I think the temptation is to imagine that I was considering supernatural explanations, that I was wondering about ghosts or resurrection or some kind of horror movie premise. I wasn't. My mind doesn't work that way. I was thinking about systems. I was thinking about how a hospital is a machine that processes people, and how that machine has rules, and how someone had found a way to make the machine process something it wasn't designed to process, and the machine had simply adapted. The machine didn't care whether Gerald Cook was alive or dead. The machine cared whether his MRN was valid, his insurance was active, his medication orders were signed, and his bed was assigned. Death was just a flag in a database, and flags could be overridden. But that logic only held if you ignored the blood. The real blood in real tubes. The real heart beating under a real stethoscope. The real voice traveling through a phone line to a wife who had already scattered or shelved the ashes. Whatever was happening, it wasn't just a records trick. Something physical was in those beds. Something physical was lifting those phone receivers and dialing numbers from memory and having conversations that lasted 7 minutes and 12 minutes and 3 minutes. Something physical was eating Jell-O and refusing tomatoes and walking hallways and signing discharge papers with handwriting that matched a dead man's signature down to the compressed letters in Cook. On March 25th, I did something reckless. I went to the Human Resources office during my lunch break and asked to see the personnel file for Raymond Carnes. The HR receptionist, a young man with very neat hair, informed me that personnel files were confidential and I would need a written request authorized by my department head. I said I understood. Then I went to the admitting department on the first floor and asked the day shift supervisor if Raymond Carnes was available. "Ray's night shift," the supervisor said. She was a short woman with a tired face and a lanyard heavy with key cards. "He comes on at 11. "Has he been here long?" "Since before me. I think he started in 2011, maybe 2010. He's a lifer." "Is he good at his job?" She gave me a look that I recognized from Denise Okoro, that brief evaluation, that social recalibration. "He's thorough," she said. "Keeps the night shift running smooth. We never have problems." "Never. Not with Ray." I thanked her and left. That evening I stayed late. I told Martin I was catching up on the ED billing audit, which was technically true. I did spend 2 hours on it. But at 10:45 p.m., I saved my work, put on my coat, and walked to the admitting department. The first floor of a hospital at 11 o'clock at night is a different country. The daytime bustle, the visitors, the volunteers, the administrative staff, the people with purpose and direction is gone. What's left is the skeleton of the institution. The security guard at the front desk, the housekeeping crew running a floor buffer down the main corridor, the distant chime of an elevator, the particular quality of fluorescent light that exists only when there are very few people beneath it. The admitting office was behind a set of double doors near the ER entrance. Through the window, I could see 2 registration stations, one occupied by a clerk I didn't recognize, and a glass-walled supervisor's office in the back. A man was sitting in the supervisor's office. He was maybe 55, with thinning hair and a plain face, wearing a hospital polo shirt and reading something on his monitor. A nameplate on his desk said, R. Carnes. I pushed through the doors. The clerk glanced at me. I held up my hospital badge and said, Data integrity. I need a minute with Ray. The clerk shrugged and went back to her screen. I walked to the supervisor's office and knocked on the glass. Raymond Carnes looked up. His eyes were pale blue and very steady. Hi, I said. I'm Nora Kauffman. I sent you an email about a registration override. I know who you are, he said. His voice was calm and unremarkable. Come in. I sat down across from his desk. The office was small and very tidy. There was a framed photo on the desk. A younger Raymond with a woman and 2 children at what looked like a state fair and a small cactus in a ceramic pot shaped like an owl. Normal things. Human things. I'm auditing Q1 overrides, I said. You used reason code 14 on MRNOO-4417832 on March 9th. Patient had a deceased flag. I remember. Can you tell me about it? Raymond leaned back in his chair. He folded his hands in his lap. Patient presented at the ER. Had ID, had insurance, matched the record. The deceased flag was clearly an error. You can see it happen sometimes. A discharge clerk selects the wrong disposition code, marks a living patient as deceased. I verified the patient's identity, cleared the flag, and processed the admission. You verified his identity. I looked at his face and I looked at his license, and they matched. And the death record, the death summary signed by Dr. Ramos, the body release authorization signed by the patient's wife, the coroner notification. Raymond looked at me. His expression did not change. I'm not a clinician, he said. I don't review death summaries. I'm a registration supervisor. A patient presents with valid identification, I process the admission. If there's a clinical documentation issue, that's for HIM to sort out. You've done this 4 times. Something shifted in his eyes. Not alarm, not guilt. Something more like acknowledgement. The way you might acknowledge a change in the weather. I've processed overrides when the system flags errors. Yes, that's part of my job. 4 patients with deceased flags, Raymond. 4 patients who died in this hospital and then came back 3 to 5 days later. You overrode the system for every one of them. I processed the admissions as they presented. Do you understand how that sounds? He looked at me for a long time. The fluorescent light in his office buzzed. Somewhere down the hall, the floor buffer changed direction. Nora, he said, let me ask you something. When those patients were here when they were in their beds, getting their medications, eating their meals, talking to their nurses, calling their families on the phone, were they real? That's not... Were they real? Did the nurses treat real people? Did the lab test real blood? Did the pharmacy dispense real drugs? Did real voices come through the phone line when their families picked up? Yes, apparently. Then what exactly is the discrepancy? I opened my mouth and closed it. He waited. The discrepancy, I said slowly, is that they were dead, according to one set of records. According to the death records. Those aren't just records, Raymond. People were mourned, funerals were held, bodies were cremated, obituaries were published. And then the patients came back, and the system processed them, and they got better, and they went home, and they called their wives and their daughters and their workplaces, and they kept their appointments. That's what the records show. Both things can't be true. Raymond unfolded his hands and placed them flat on his desk. But they are both in the system, he said. Both documented, both verified, both real as far as the institution is concerned. You're asking me to decide which set of records is wrong, and I'm telling you that's not my job. My job is to process what's in front of me. And what was in front of me, 4 times, was a living patient with valid identification who needed medical care. He paused. What would you have had me do, Nora? Turn them away? I didn't answer. I couldn't, because inside the logic of his position, the question was genuinely difficult. If a man walks into a hospital in distress, with ID in his hand and his name on his lips and real symptoms in his body, what does a registration clerk do? The system says he's dead, but he's standing right there. Which do you believe, the database or the man? I stood up. Thank you for your time, I said. Nora. I stopped in the doorway. The system works, he said. It processes what comes through the door. That's what it's for. You should be glad it works. I drove home. I sat in my apartment. The dry cleaner's hum was louder than usual, or I was more aware of it, and it seemed to come from everywhere, from the floor, from the walls, from the space between the crack in the bathroom mirror. I thought about what Raymond had said. The system works. It processes what comes through the door. On March 26th, Gerald Cook's follow-up appointment was scheduled for 10:30 a.m. at the outpatient cardiology clinic. I knew this because I had checked the scheduling system 5 days earlier. I spent the morning at my desk, not working. At 10:15, I took the elevator to the 3rd floor, where the cardiology clinic occupied a suite of beige carpeted rooms with framed watercolors of sailboats on the walls. I sat in the waiting area. There were 8 chairs, 4 of them occupied by patients in various stages of aging and discomfort. A television mounted near the ceiling played a morning talk show with the volume off. The receptionist was a young woman with her hair in a braid, who was simultaneously answering the phone and checking someone in. At 10:28, the clinic door opened and an elderly man walked in. White hair, deep-set eyes, slightly crooked nose. He was wearing a brown jacket over a plaid shirt, and he walked with the deliberate care of someone who knows his body requires negotiation. A woman was with him, shorter, with gray blonde hair and a purse clutched against her side. She held his elbow as they approached the desk. Gerald Cook, the man said to the receptionist. 10:30 with Dr. Anand. Have a seat, Mr. Cook. We'll call you back shortly. He turned and sat down 3 chairs from me. His wife sat beside him. She opened her purse and took out a small plastic bag of butter cookies and offered him one. He took it, bit into it, and chewed slowly, looking at the muted television. He looked like a man waiting for a doctor's appointment. He looked like a man who had butter cookies and a wife and a granddaughter who played violin and a heart that didn't work as well as it used to. He looked entirely, completely, mundanely real. I watched him for 11 minutes. I watched him eat 2 cookies. I watched him rub his knee absently. I watched his wife lean over and whisper something that made him shake his head and then reach over and pat her hand. I watched a nurse open the inner door and call, "Gerald?" And I watched him stand up slowly and follow her inside. His wife stayed in the waiting room. She put the bag of cookies back in her purse and folded her hands and looked at the muted television, and her face held the patient, slightly tired expression of a woman who has spent 41 years waiting in rooms while her husband is examined. I looked at her and I thought about the phone calls. March 10th, 11:14 a.m., 7 minutes. March 10th, 6:47 p.m., 12 minutes. Her phone had rung and she had answered, and she had talked to the man who was now 3 chairs away from me. The man whose funeral she had attended 8 days before those calls. The man whose ashes she had received in an urn 2 days after those calls. She had talked to him. She had brought him cookies in the hospital. She had picked him up on discharge day, and now she was sitting in a cardiology waiting room with her hands folded, waiting for him again. She did not look like a woman experiencing a miracle. She did not look like a woman in shock or denial or confusion. She looked like a woman who had accepted something, the way you accept a change in the weather, not because you understand it, but because it's happening. And the alternative to acceptance is standing in the rain arguing with the sky. He did not look at me. Neither of them did. They were just people in a waiting room. They were just a man and his wife, and the system had processed them, and they were here. I went back to my office. I sat at my desk. Martin was on the phone. I looked at my computer screen where my email inbox showed 47 unread messages. None of them from Gerald Maines. None of them from Patricia Ewan. None of them from the security department. The institution had received my reports and my requests and my questions, and it had processed them the same way it processed everything, by absorbing them into its systems and continuing to function. I opened the manila folder and looked at my printouts. The death records, the readmission records, the lab results, the telecom logs, the MPI merge log, the override credentials, all of it documented, all of it real, all of it sitting in my desk drawer in a building where 4 people who had died were currently alive and keeping their appointments and calling their families and eating cookies. That afternoon, I tried one more thing. I called the County Vital Records office. I identified myself and asked to verify the status of a death certificate for Gerald Allen Cook, filed approximately March 6th. The clerk put me on hold. When she came back, she said, "I'm showing a death certificate filed on March 6th. Is there a specific question? Is it still active? Has it been amended or voided?" "Let me check." A pause. The sound of typing. "No amendments, no void. The certificate is active and on file. So as far as your records are concerned, Gerald Cook is dead." "As far as our records are concerned, yes. A death certificate was filed and has not been challenged." I thanked her and hung up. The county said Gerald Cook was dead. The hospital said Gerald Cook was alive. Both systems were functioning correctly. Neither system was aware of the contradiction because they didn't talk to each other in any way that would surface it. The death existed in one database. The life existed in another. And in the gap between those two databases, in the space where no system was watching, something was moving. I left work at 5 p.m. in that day, and I drove not to my apartment but back to Resurrection Lutheran Church. I don't know what I was looking for. Confirmation, maybe. Proof that the world outside the hospital still remembered what had happened. The bulletin board still showed the program for Gerald Cook's celebration of life. It had not been removed. It had not been changed. It was there, behind the glass, between the soup supper schedule and the youth group car wash, and it was real. And the man I had watched eat butter cookies 3 hours earlier was also real. And I could not hold both of those realities in my mind at the same time without feeling something stretch and thin inside me, some membrane between what I knew and what I could accept. The next morning, I submitted my resignation. That's not the end of the story. I need you to understand that. I submitted my resignation not because I had finished, but because I had arrived at a boundary I couldn't cross from inside the institution. Gerald Maines accepted my resignation with what I can only describe as gentle relief. He thanked me for my 4 years of service and said my final day would be April 9th, 2 weeks out. He did not ask why I was leaving. He did not mention Gerald Cook or the incident report or the footage request or the override audit. He shook my hand and told me the exit interview would be scheduled by HR. During my final 2 weeks, I copied everything. Not the digital records. I didn't have the access or the nerve to exfiltrate data from a hospital system. But I copied my own notes, my own queries, my own observations. I wrote down every date, every MRN, every timestamp, every name. I wrote down what Denise Okoro had told me about the butter cookies and the granddaughter's violin recital. I wrote down what Raymond Carnes had said about processing what comes through the door. I wrote down the phone calls, the 7 minutes and the 12 minutes and the 3 minutes. I wrote down the feeling of watching Gerald Cook eat a cookie in the cardiology waiting room 3 weeks after his funeral, while his wife sat beside him with her hands folded and her face holding that patient, slightly tired expression that I will never be able to forget. I put all of it in the manila folder, and I took the manila folder home on my last day, and nobody stopped me, and nobody asked what was in it. On my last day, I logged into the employee self-service portal one final time to download my W-2 and confirm my last pay stub information. The portal loaded the way it always did, my name in the upper right corner, my employee ID, my department, my assigned location, data integrity, floor 2, room 214B. I looked at it for a long moment. Then I logged out, turned in my badge to HR, signed the separation acknowledgement form, and walked out of Mercy River General Hospital. It's been 7 weeks since I left. I work at a health information consulting firm now, doing remote chart audits for small rural hospitals that can't afford a full-time compliance staff. It's boring. It's exactly the kind of boring I used to find comforting. But 3 days ago, something changed. I was auditing discharge records for a 25-bed critical access hospital in another state, a place I've never visited, in a part of the country I've never been to. I was checking discharge disposition codes against readmission rates, which is a standard quality metric, when I found a patient who had been discharged as deceased on February 12th and readmitted on February 16th under the same MRN. The override reason code was 14. Patient identity verified, previous deceased flag entered in error. I ran my query, the one I'd built at Mercy River. I adapted it for this hospital's slightly different database structure and ran it against their last 12 months of data. It returned 2 results. 2 dead patients readmitted at a 25-bed hospital in a state I've never been to, with the same override, the same reason code, the same 3 to 5 day gap. I closed the file. I sat at my desk in my apartment, above the dry cleaner, with a hum coming through the floor and the crack in the bathroom mirror waiting in the next room. And I thought about Raymond Carnes saying, "The system works." I thought about the county clerk saying the death certificate was active and on file. I thought about the wristband printer generating a band for a dead man. I thought about the lab analyzer processing blood that should not have existed. I thought about the phone ringing in Brenda Cook's house and the voice that came through the line. I thought about Denise Okoro remembering butter cookies. I thought about a system so large and so distributed that it doesn't have a single point where someone could stand and see the whole contradiction at once, where the death is in one database and the life is in another, and the gap between them is not a bug, but a feature, a space where something can exist without being questioned because no one system holds the complete picture. I started checking the other hospitals I audit, the small ones, the rural ones, the places with 20 beds and a part-time IT staff and nobody like me looking at the reconciliation reports. I haven't found it everywhere, but I found it in 3 more facilities in the past week. The same pattern, the same override, the same reason code, the same 3 to 5 day gap between death and return. It's in the system, not in one system. In the system, the way we build medical records, the way we manage identity, the way we process human beings into data, and data into encounters and encounters into billing codes. The gap is structural. It was always there, the gap between the database that records a death and the database that admits a patient. And something has found that gap the way water finds a crack, and it is moving through it. And the system is holding the door open because holding the door open is what the system was built to do. I don't know what the patients are. I want to be clear about that. I don't know if Gerald Cook is Gerald Cook. I don't know what walks through the ER doors at 2 in the morning with a dead man's license and a dead man's symptoms and a dead man's handwriting. I don't know what sits in a hospital bed and dials a phone from memory and talks to a dead man's wife for 12 minutes about things only they would know. I don't know what eats butter cookies and refuses tomatoes and walks hallways and signs discharge papers with handwriting that matches a dead man's signature down to the compressed letters in Cook. I don't know, and I have stopped trying to figure it out, because I've realized that the question is not what they are. The question is what the system does when they arrive. And the answer is, the system processes them. The system gives them a wristband and a bed and a medication schedule and a phone and a follow-up appointment. The system does exactly what it was designed to do. It admits, it treats, it discharges, it bills. It does not ask whether you should exist. It only asks whether your insurance is active. And the thing that keeps me awake, the thing that makes me sit up at 2 in the morning listening to the dry cleaner's hum and staring at the manila folder on my kitchen table next to the chipped ceramic leaf, is not the patients. It's the override. Reason code 14. Previous deceased flag entered in error. Someone, somewhere, in every hospital where this is happening, is looking at the system's single remaining objection. It's one attempt to say this person is dead. You cannot admit a dead person and is telling the system, no, you're wrong. The death was the mistake. Let them in. And the system believes it every time. Maybe Raymond Carnes is right. Maybe the system works. Maybe it's processing exactly what it's supposed to process, and the only error is the one that says these people can't come back, and the override is the correction, and I'm the discrepancy. The one element that looked at two mutually exclusive truths and couldn't let both of them be real. I don't know how to close the gap. I don't even know if it should be closed, because the patients get better. That's the thing I haven't been able to get past. Whatever they are, they respond to treatment. Their blood tests improve, their symptoms resolve. They walk the hallway, they eat the Jell-O, they sign the discharge papers, they call their families, they go home. They keep their follow-up appointments. The system processes them, and they get better, and they leave, and they live. And the only evidence that anything is wrong is a flag in a database that someone with the right credential can override in under a minute. 2 days ago, I was auditing patient satisfaction surveys for a small hospital in the Midwest, the kind of routine work that used to feel like background noise. I was scanning through the responses, checking completion rates and flagging incomplete forms, when I stopped on one entry. It was from a patient at Mercy River General. The survey had been completed online on April the 2nd, 8 days after the cardiology follow-up appointment I had witnessed. The patient name field was blank. Satisfaction. Surveys are anonymized, but the visit date matched, and the clinic matched, and the free text comment at the bottom read, "Everyone was so kind to Gerald, as always. The nurses on 4 West remembered him. Dr. Anand is wonderful. We are very grateful he is doing so well. BC." BC Brenda Cook. She had filled out a patient satisfaction survey for her dead husband's follow-up appointment. She had given it 5 stars. She had thanked the nurses by unit. She had written, "As always," which meant this was not new to her, which meant she had been through this before, which meant she had buried her husband and then watched him come back, and she had accepted it the way you accept a prescription or a discharge instruction, as something the system had provided, something the institution had processed, something that was now simply part of how things worked. 5 stars. We are very grateful he is doing so well. I closed the survey. I put my laptop on the kitchen table next to the manila folder and the chipped ceramic leaf and the coffee mug with the brown ring. I walked into the bathroom and turned on the light and looked at the crack in the mirror and saw my face divided by that thin diagonal line, one half slightly higher than the other. And I thought about how a system sees identity not as a face, not as a soul, not as a consciousness, but as a number. An MRN. A flag. A field in a database that says alive or dead. And the only difference between those two states is which box is checked, and the box can be unchecked by anyone with the right credential. I went back to the kitchen, and I opened my laptop, and I did something I had told myself I wouldn't do. I logged into the Mercy River General Employee Self-Service Portal. My credentials still worked. They hadn't been deactivated. 7 weeks after my last day, 7 weeks after I had turned in my badge and signed the separation form and walked out of the building, the system still recognized me. The portal loaded with my name in the upper right corner the way it always did. Kauffman, Nora J. Employee ID Department. Hire date. And my assigned location. Data Integrity, Floor 3, Room 318. I stared at it. Floor 3, Room 318. My office had been on the 2nd floor, Room 214B. I had checked it on the portal the day before I resigned, and it had said Floor 2. I had worked on Floor 2 for 4 years. I had taken the elevator to Floor 2 every morning. I had sat in Room 214B with Martin Hess, and eaten lunch at my desk, and looked at spreadsheets until my eyes itched. Floor 2. I was certain. But the system said Floor 3, and I remembered with a feeling like the ground shifting 1 inch to the left that on the morning this all started, That morning in the parking lot, when I sat in my car for 7 minutes, I could not remember whether my office was on the second floor or the third floor. Both answers had felt equally correct. And I had gone in, and I had worked, and I had found Gerald Cook's impossible readmission, and I had never thought about it again, because I had been so focused on his discrepancy that I had not noticed my own. The system had my location wrong. Or the system had my location right and my memory had it wrong. Or the system had changed my location after I left, reassigned me to a floor in a room that I had never worked in because the system was still processing me, still updating my record, still treating me as something that belonged to it. I closed the portal. I sat in the dark. The dry cleaner hummed. The crack in the mirror waited. The manila folder sat on the table with everything I had documented, every timestamp and MRN and override code. Every piece of evidence that the system could hold two mutually exclusive truths about a person and feel no contradiction. And I thought about reason code 14, previous deceased flag entered in error. And I thought about my employee record, still active, still updating, still placing me inside a building I no longer work in, on a floor I may or may not have ever occupied. And I thought about Gerald Cook walking into a cardiology clinic 3 weeks after his funeral, and his wife filling out a satisfaction survey, and the system giving him 5 stars and a follow-up appointment, and a wristband and a bed and a life, because the system does not ask whether you should exist. The system only asks whether your record is active. My record is active. I checked. I don't know what that means yet. I don't know if it means anything, but I know that the system doesn't let go of what it has, and I know that reason code 14 can be applied to any flag. And I know that somewhere in the gap between what I remember and what the system says, there is a discrepancy that I cannot reconcile, and I am the only one looking at it, and no one is going to send me a response. I'm going to keep checking the hospitals. I'm going to keep running the query. And if you work in medical records or health information or compliance or registration, if you're someone whose job it is to look at data and make sure it makes sense, I need you to do something for me. Run the query. Check your dead against your living. Look for the 3 to 5 day gap. Look for reason code 14. Look for the override. And then check your own record. Check your employee file. Check your location, your department, your status. Make sure the system sees you the way you see yourself. Make sure the fields match. Make sure nothing has been updated that you didn't update. Make sure you are where you think you are, because the system is very, very good at processing. And once it has your number, I don't think it gives it back. And some mornings, more mornings now than before. I sit in my car before starting the drive to nowhere in particular, and I can't remember which floor I live on. Second floor, above the dry cleaner. I know that. I've always known that. But the knowing has started to feel the way Gerald Cook's death felt to the system that readmitted him. Like a flag that is technically still there, technically still active, but no longer treated as authoritative. Like something that can be overridden by someone with the right credential and a reason code that says the previous entry was made in error. I live on the second floor. I'm almost certain. But both answers are starting to feel equally correct.